Okay. Okay. Webinar on UW air travel emissions. My name is Marilyn Ostergren. I'm in the UW Sustainability Office, and I'm joined by Jeremy Hess, faculty with UW Medicine, and Jamie Mayerfeld, faculty with Political Science. Appreciate your time and attention to this important conversation. I'm going to give you a little bit of contextual information, but first, want to hear from you. So I'm going to start a poll, and we're just interested. You'll see that there's both sort of your role, and then also at the bottom, whether or not you've already traveled for the UW. And this is multiple choice, so you can answer as many as you want. So I'm about to launch that poll here. Looks like most everybody has participated. Oh, there's a few more coming in. And I'll show you the results here in a moment. But mostly staff, some faculty, some students. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So, and it looks like about half of us have traveled for the UW and about half or a little less than half have not yet. So thanks for that information. It helps us orient to who we're talking to. Thank you. Okay. So the UW, we have all sorts of sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Here are some of the major categories, from buildings, from our fleet, from commuting, from air travel, from food. These are some of the major ones we track. And in fact, we have efforts underway to reduce our emissions from buildings. We have a major decarbonization effort and efficiency efforts ongoing. We've been starting to electrify the fleet. We've been working for years and years and years on reducing the higher impact forms of commuting. And Housing and Food Services is doing some great work to increase the plant forward food options. Air travel has been a gap. And so that's a big reason for this conversation. And of course, there's a reason it's been a big gap. It's a really challenging one. So now I'm going to pass it on to Jeremy to talk about that challenge.
Thanks, Marilyn. Just switching over control of the screens here. So, as Marilyn said, flying is really pretty fundamental to a lot of what we do here at UW. Thank you.
I think I accidentally did that, Jamie. Sorry.
No worries. And this chart here gives you a sense of the volume of flying that we do. And it spans from before the pandemic, shows you our flight activity during the pandemic, and then flight activity through roughly the beginning of 2023. And so you can see there's a large volume of flying that happens with some seasonal adjustments, as you might expect, or seasonal variability, as you might expect, pre-pandemic. And then during the pandemic, when we had travel restrictions, we did our business without traveling, or essentially without traveling. But as soon as the pandemic restrictions ended, we started to travel again, because it's pretty fundamental to a lot of the different things that we do. And as you can see well, now I'm having trouble advancing. I'm sorry. Thank you. So as you can see here, this figure shows global travel activity extending up to present time. And we don't have travel data for UW from that period after the beginning of 2023 yet, but we can fully expect that our travel behavior has followed along this curve, and that we are back at pre-pandemic levels. We certainly are back at pre-pandemic levels of activity overall at the university, and most likely the data when in hand will bear out that we're also at pre-pandemic levels in terms of air travel as well. This figure here shows a breakdown of flights per year by unit. And it's a bit of a busy figure, but the point that we wanted to make here is one that no matter the size of the organized unit at UW, some travel tends to be involved in their activities. And second, that there's a rough but clear correlation between size of the unit and travel activity. And this reinforces the understanding that travel is a fundamental part of what people at the university do, and that it's important, regardless of the types of activities they're doing, whether it's teaching, athletics, etc., that the while there may be some larger units on campus that have particular perspectives on travel and perspectives on the way in which travel influences or is fundamental to their activities. In fact, this is a shared challenge across all the different units and all the different activities that the university undertakes. Which leads to the challenge. And here we're going to post another poll and try and get a sense of, in your experience, why you have traveled. So Marilyn, if you want to launch that one.
And this is another multiple choice, so mark all that apply. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll. Got about 82% participation here. So you can see the results. Not surprising, conference and networking is way up there at the top, but we've got a fair distribution of reasons for flying. Oh, sorry. Now you can see it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So that poll's results underline that there's a really diverse range of reasons that people at UW fly. We're a top tier institution in terms of our research and training, and a large institution with collaborations regionally and globally. We have a lot of responsibilities to a number of different communities, and we service those communities and our students through travel. And as we saw in the poll, conferences and networking are certainly a significant part of that. Knowledge sharing as part of our role as educators, and learning and building networks as part of our role as students and trainees. Of course, there are often requirements to travel to the field, to do research, to share research results, to participate in processes of evaluating grants, and participating in extramural service. We have many opportunities to go and teach and learn with other communities at other universities. That's an important part of faculty work. Developing professional skills among our staff, among our trainees. Again, while we are a very large institution with many different training programs, there are lots of opportunities outside of our institution, and we like our students, staff, and faculty to be able to take advantage of those. We want to maintain UW's reputation and to engage institutionally, and often we have to travel to do that. The travel we do sometimes is required. Sometimes we would prefer not to do some of the travel. In fact, we might prefer to engage in some of the extramural service we do and other things through other means, but funders require that travel, and organizations that we may be a part of require that travel. And there's a sense among faculty that we have to travel in order to develop and build our reputations, in order to be promoted. And while certainly remote opportunities have shifted that expectation somewhat, there is a requirement at some level that we are out in the world. Then lastly, of course, study abroad and athletic competitions. Both of those are really important part of student experience and life on campus, and part of the UW's sense of identity. And so there are significant motivations for traveling in both of those cases as well. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Jamie, who will talk about some of the impacts of all this travel.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to see if I can get control of the shared screen. Let's see if I can do this. Not yet. Okay, let's see. It's not working, so I may ask you to.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, and I think I accidentally. Okay, go ahead. I'll forward
Okay,
them.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here to be part of this webinar and presentation. And I want to thank Marilyn and Jeremy for working with me on the working group as part of the Sustainability Office to address some of the challenges that we are facing with regard to air travel. And I think Jeremy did a really nice job of discussing the benefits of air travel. Air travel is often necessary for the work that we do as academics or students or members of the University of Washington community, or it's very valuable. But at the same time, air travel has certain costs, particularly in relation to the climate crisis. So we also need to be aware of those costs, and we need to start thinking about how to address those costs and maybe think about opportunities to reduce flying where possible. So I'd like to begin my remarks with some quotes. First, here's a quote from Anna-Marie Kause, the president of the University of Washington. The University of Washington is committed to doing our part to reach a carbon neutral future. Second, here's a quote from Park Wilde, who is an economist at Tufts University. If your university or research institution wants to treat the climate crisis like a crisis, it should take aviation seriously. And then finally, I have a quote from Peter Thorne, who's a world-renowned climate scientist, who delivered these remarks as part of a press conference by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change a year ago. And Peter Thorne said, "We are beyond the point where climate change can be somebody else's problem." And this is a really important point. What he's saying is that sometimes we tend to think that in order to address the climate crisis, other people need to change, but we don't need to change. And what he's saying is, no, we all need to change. This is a challenge for all of us. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so what are the costs of flying? And I'm going to focus on the issue of the climate crisis, but there are other issues as well. Flying is a large and increasing contributor to climate change because of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with flying. Flying is carbon intensive. Every time you get on an airplane, you yourself contribute significantly to the greenhouse gas emissions that cause global warming. Flying is tied to climate injustice. That's a really serious problem. I'll say more about that in a moment. But fundamentally, the issue is that through frequent flying, a small portion of the world's population contributes disproportionately to climate devastation. And that's the central challenge here. Excuse me. And then there's some harms that go beyond climate change. So one issue that we as a task force have, or we as a working group have been looking at, and is that air traffic does cause air pollution and noise pollution that is harmful to communities that live under flight paths near airports. Next slide, please. Let's step back a little bit and look at the larger picture. And the larger picture is that there is a climate crisis that is causing devastation already. It's killing large numbers of people, causing devastation to ecosystems and living beings around the world. And worse is in store. We are moving in a direction that is leading us to a catastrophe unless we change our current practices. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, has said that in order to avoid catastrophe, the world must limit average global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And what kind of reductions do they have in mind? The IPCC has also told us that in order to avoid passing the 1.5 degree Celsius limit, the world needs to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by roughly 50% by 2030, and by something close to 100% by 2050. Now, climate scholars and activists often use the concept of a carbon budget to refer to the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we can still produce without causing a climate catastrophe. So specifically, how many greenhouse gases can we still emit without reaching the 1.5 degree temperature barrier? And that number is rapidly shrinking. A few years ago, the IPCC estimated that our remaining carbon budget was 400 billion tons of greenhouse gases. But recent studies have shown that it is, in the last few years, already shrunk to around 150 billion tons of greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. So if you study the carbon budget, you'll come across a lot of graphs that look like this. So this is the graph that you should fix in your mind when you think about the climate crisis and when you think about the carbon budget. So what does this graph show? That black line on top represents annual greenhouse gas emissions. The shaded gray area represents the cumulative total historical greenhouse gas emissions that we've already produced. And then the quickly downward sloping black line shows you how quickly we need to reduce our annual greenhouse gas emissions in order to stay within our carbon budget. And so the brown shaded area shows us our remaining carbon budget. That's the amount of greenhouse gases we can still emit. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think of when you look at this picture? And what I think of when I look at this picture is that there's really, you can think of it as a steep slope. And our job is to very carefully make our way down that steep slope. It's going to be a challenge, but we can do it. And if we do it, we will avoid climate catastrophe. The thing we don't want to do is to continue on our current path, as it were, to take a running leap, which would be like leaping off a cliff, and the consequences would not be very happy. All right, next slide, please. We face an issue of climate injustice, and that's because today countries, groups, and individuals are using up that carbon budget at highly unequal rates. Moreover, those who contribute the most to climate change, those who are using up the carbon budget at the fastest rate, will tend to escape its worst effects. So this is an issue of climate injustice, both in terms of who's causing the problem and who will suffer the consequences of the problem. And flying in particular epitomizes climate injustice because so much of the flying in the world is done by a very small number of people. There was a study done by the Guardian newspaper, which concluded that taking a long-haul flight generates more carbon emissions than the average person in dozens of countries around the world produces in a whole year, just one long-haul flight. One way of thinking about climate injustice is to look in particular at per capita emissions. How many greenhouse gases are you personally emitting? And how does that compare with the average per person greenhouse gas emissions around in the country as a whole, or in the world as a whole, or in the world as a whole if the world reduces greenhouse gases sufficiently in order to avoid a climate catastrophe? Next slide, please. So this graph shows you, gives you some information about per capita greenhouse gas emissions that illustrates the problem of climate injustice. So this is a bar chart, and the first bar tells us the average greenhouse gas emissions per person in the world today. It's around 6.9 tons per person of greenhouse gases that cause climate change, global warming. But I want you to look in particular at the second and third and fourth bars. The second bar is shows us where per capita greenhouse gas emissions need to be in the year 2030 if we're going to avoid climate catastrophe. The third bar, and this is by IPCC calculations, and the third bar shows you where per capita greenhouse gas emissions need to be by the year 2050 to avoid climate catastrophe. If anything, these two bars, the second and third bar, are a bit too optimistic because they were calculated a few years ago, and the situation has grown worse. Now, the fourth bar shows you the greenhouse gas emissions associated with one single passenger's flight on an airplane from Seattle to Newark, round trip, nonstop economy. And that's 1.4 tons of greenhouse gas, or I should say 1.4 tons of carbon pollution or greenhouse gas emissions. So notice that that is already 38% of where we need to be in the year 2030 in terms of average per person annual greenhouse gas emissions, and it's 50% greater than where we need to be in the year 2050 in terms of per person annual greenhouse gas emissions. And then the two bottom bars show you the extreme inequality between countries. So today, the average per person greenhouse gas emissions in Malawi are 1.2 tons. In the United States, they're 17.6 tons. However, the 17.6 ton figure is just an average, and that average conceals huge discrepancies or huge differences between Americans, people living in the United States, and those differences are very strongly correlated with income. And we'll see that in the next graph. Could you show the next graph, please? So this graph is identical to the previous graph, but I've just added an additional bar at the bottom. And that bar shows us the average greenhouse gas emissions of the richest 10% of Americans. And who are the richest 10% of Americans? They're people with a household income of over $200,000 per year. There's a little typo.
That's a typo, yeah.
But we'll correct that later. And some of us will fall into that category. And so that this is just a reminder that some of us are causing greenhouse gas emissions, using up the carbon budget at a rate much faster than others. And flying has a lot to do with that. Flying has a lot to do with that. All right, next slide, please. So there's a wonderful article that I want to call your attention to. It's written by my colleagues, Nevis Dolshak, who is the director of the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs here at the University of Washington, and Asim Prakash, who's the director of the Center for Environmental Politics here at the University of Washington. And here's just a brief quote from their wonderful article, Different Approaches to Reducing Aviation Emissions, which repeats or reinforces some of the content of my remarks. If it were a country, the aviation industry would be the world's 7th largest carbon emitter. Its emissions are more than twice that of California, which accounts for 1.2% of global emissions. By 2050, aviation emissions could rise to 22% of global emissions. Aviation emissions epitomize climate inequity. 1% of the world's population is responsible for 50% of carbon aviation emissions. Next slide, please. All right. I think that thinking about this challenge is also an opportunity for us to reflect on and become more aware of certain inequities or exclusions within academia, including the University of Washington. And although it's true that flying provides many benefits to members of the University of Washington community, not everybody is able to enjoy those benefits to the same degree. So some individuals are excluded either partly or wholly from the benefits now associated with academic flying. Who are those people? To a greater or lesser extent, they include graduate students, contingent faculty, people with disabilities, people with health conditions, people with caring obligations, people with visa restrictions, people with financial constraints, people who can't afford to make a plane trip or can't afford incur all the expenses that are typically associated with air travel, such as hotel, etc. And then there are people who don't want to fly because of reasons of climate conscience. So these are people who are excluded to some extent, to some greater or lesser extent, from the benefits that we now associate with academic flying. So partly in order to address the climate crisis, but also partly in order to become more inclusive, I think we should start thinking as a community more seriously about non-flight alternatives to academic flying, things such as online workshops and conferences, internal conferences, drawing on people from within the university, regional conferences, or multi-hub conferences where people in different locations use the internet to connect their conference activity. These are ways to include more people in academic activities. We've learned a lot in the last few years about how to run and sponsor these activities in a way that's high quality and beneficial and rewarding. And we really should draw on this body of growing expertise and knowledge. Yes, there are some trade-offs for sometimes choosing non-flight alternatives to flying options, but some of these trade-offs might be justified in order to reduce climate harms and also in order to be more inclusive. Next slide, please. All right, so if we sort of absorb all this information and think about it and are worried about the climate harms of flying and the exclusions that are also linked to academic flying, what should we do? How should we move forward? Well, the suggestion that I think we all want to offer is that we should look for feasible, responsible, possible ways to reduce University of Washington related flying. Those options do exist and we should explore them. And when we do fly, we should look for ways to take responsibility for the emissions we create. So, you know, the motto we're working with is to fly less and take responsibility. And I think that's a good rubric for action looking forward. Tackling this problem will require everybody to participate. It'll require both top-down action, but also bottom-up efforts. And above all, what's needed is commitment from the university, formal, genuine commitment to tackling this problem, leadership, university leaders saying that we're actually going to do this and we're going to get behind it, coordination among all members of the University of Washington community, and then broad participation and support. We need lots of ideas, lots of suggestions, lots of initiative, and we invite everybody who wants to join and support this initiative to contact us and to lend their support. So I think I have just one more slide. Yeah, so this is just my final slide for my remarks, and I want to close with a quote that I offered at the beginning, that once again, we are beyond the point where climate change can be somebody else's problem. It's a problem for all of us. All right, thank you so much. I think I'll turn it back to Jeremy now.
Thank you, Jamie. So in summary, we fly a lot in our community, and we fly often for good reason. We are involved in a number of different activities. Next slide, please. That enrich our work, our learning, our students' opportunities, and the institution's reputation. Next slide, please. But as Jamie so eloquently pointed out, all of this travel causes a number of different hazards that cause harm to people's health. And that harm is felt currently. It's felt through emissions from air travel, particulate emissions, which are harmful to health, noise emissions, which are harmful to health. And those harms are not equitably distributed. It also causes future harm by contributing to the climate crisis, and the impacts there are also starkly inequitable. Next slide, please. We're taking broad and bold action across the university on a number of fronts to reduce our emissions, in keeping with what the scientific community knows is an important process for and schedule for reducing our emissions and keeping within our carbon budget. And air travel has been a bit of an outlier in that process. As we make steady progress in these other locations, that's becoming more and more of a pressing issue. And next slide, please. So we, as Jamie nicely outlined, have a lot of opportunities to think differently about how we pursue our mission and the role of air travel in it. And so we invite you to be part of this conversation today and in the future. And we'd like to have a poll here to get a sense of some of the things that you see as opportunities for us. And then we'll open for questions.
Okay. I'm going to close the poll. Appreciate your participation. And I'll pass it back to you, Jamie. Jeremy, sorry.
Okay. So other universities and academic communities are taking action in this space. Here's a list of some institutions that are implementing air travel programs and policies as part of their climate action. If you're interested to learn more, you can get in touch with us and we can share with you information about each of these institutional policies. Many of them include a combination of offsets and fees and other strategies for changing the culture around flying and reducing the felt need to travel by air. We are very keen to get your input and to have a discussion. We recognize that flying is so embedded in so many things that we do and important to our mission. And to move this conversation forward, we need to figure out ways to maintain our mission while also maintaining our commitment to population health and doing no harm. So look forward to the conversation with you. Thank you. Marilyn, you're on mute.
We will have a follow-up. This is sort of the first part of the conversation. We're about to do a Q&A session, but we will be coming back in May for part 2, where we'll talk more about our initial ideas. Again, we'll share what you've just shared in the poll and talk about our initial ideas for how to tackle this problem. So hope to see you there as well. But now we're open for Q&A. And Lisa, are you able to see the questions coming in?
Yeah, thanks, Marilyn. So one of the first questions that we had in the Q&A was, can we track inbound air travel? So for example, guest speakers, visiting scholars, and researchers. And maybe that's a question for you, Marilyn.
Yeah, so I've been dealing with the data. what the data we have is for all flights paid for by the UW, and that includes, when we pay for other people to come here, but we don't take responsibility for flights that other universities are paying for.
Thanks, Marilyn. So one person, I just want to address this one quickly because it's an easy one. So yes, this recording and the slide deck will be made available after the presentation. So if you go to UW Sustainability's website, you will be able to find this recording under our webinar series. So thanks for asking that. Okay, we had another question that said, what does taking responsibility for emissions look like? And I think we're going to get into that with the May webinar, but any of our three panelists, would you like to provide a short answer to that?
I could, or you could, Lisa.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to. So one of the things that we're going to do with the May 15th webinar is the Air Travel Working Group has put together a framework of how can we tackle this really difficult issue. And so Jamie, with his presentation, noted that we're looking at sort of a two-pronged strategy of flying less and then also taking responsibility for emissions when we do fly. And so we will go through in May a draft proposal that we've prepared and want to share with our UW community that looks at that two-pronged approach and was developed using models from other universities, other institutions of higher ed. So those could be, in terms of flying less, it's all different kinds of tools and resources to help people have remote meetings, to take the train or carpool or other forms of transportation if it makes sense, rather than flying if it's a pretty close distance. And then the take responsibility could be any sort of myriad of financial incentives or a financial fee that's paid on a per trip basis that would then contribute to reducing emissions from our campus infrastructure, for example. So great question. We've got a few more coming in. Another question is, what about goods that are shipped by air? So Marilyn, that might be a good one for you to answer with goods and services.
Yeah, we do. We did a greenhouse gas inventory that was just published at the beginning of the year. And one of the things we've newly started to try to track is emissions from goods and services. And that does encompass the travel associated with producing and delivering goods and services. So it's sort of a new area. So it's hard to measure very precisely, but it is something we're wanting to look at.
Great, thanks, Marilyn. Okay, and another question that has come in from James is, I used to work for the Meany Center for the Performing Arts. Its business is presenting artists that aren't in Washington State. I'm not sure how one could reduce air emissions for visiting artists, as that's the point of the business. I don't have a solution, but just showing how difficult the question is to address. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, James. And I think, I think these are great. This is exactly why we're doing this and having these conversations, is to understand, the sort of the depth and breadth of this issue. And I think we're not going to be able to answer or solve all of these different scenarios all at once. So I think the idea is that as a community, we can develop a plan or a framework for how to start an air travel reduction program and where we should focus our efforts. And this would be, one of the many pieces of a complicated puzzle. So thank you for that comment.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just throw in too, Jeremy's portion of the presentation is sort of an effort to totally acknowledge that this is hard. There isn't a whole batch of superfluous flying that's happening. There are a lot of good reasons for a lot of flying. So, but that doesn't mean we don't, shouldn't address it. But it is helpful to understand exactly how hard it is, and then go ahead and challenge and figure out how to address it anyway.
So we have another question in, someone saying, I'm interested in what you are doing in addition to air travel emission issues. What about vehicle commuting to UW? It seems that we have two opposing goals, preferring to have everyone, students, faculty, staff on site at the institution while having the goal of emissions reduction. I'll offer it to any panelists that want to address that first, and if not, I'm happy to address that. Okay, I guess I'll take a stab at that. Great question. So UW is, as Marilyn mentioned, and since we only have an hour, we didn't go in depth on some of those other areas of how we're addressing UW emissions from fossil fuel combustion, for example, to provide heat and hot water across our campus and our tri-campus. We also didn't go into detail on commuting or getting our UW fleet and vehicles off of fossil fuels. We have a lot more information on those aspects on UW Sustainability's website and are really making some excellent progress, I'd say, on all of those. And then, I hear you. I think we're always weighing costs and benefits of emissions saved from working remotely or being remote versus being in person, whether it's for a conference, whether it's for learning in the classroom. But I think what you'll find from our most recent greenhouse gas emissions inventory for the UW tri-campus is that we're really trying to focus on the largest areas of our emissions. And so air travel is one of those. Commuting is also up there in terms of a substantial source of emissions. In terms of the actions that UW has taken, we've already, I think, been on the leading edge of that in terms of providing free or subsidized U-passes so that folks are not commuting alone in their vehicles, for example. But again, these are not easy issues to tackle. So appreciate that question. All right, we've got another question. I recently took several flights to give talks and attend conferences. I was the only UW person on the plane. Having seen a similar presentation like this before, I asked the airline staff if I didn't get on the plane, would the plane still take off or would they cancel the flight? The flights all had people waiting for seats. How would me not flying have helped lower climate emissions? It would have only prevented me from professional development opportunities. So good question. Any of our panelists want to answer this one?
I can talk about that a little bit. So thank you for that question. I mean, so it's a good question, and people ask that. I've heard people ask that question before. I think flying is, what social scientists call a collective action problem, or greenhouse gases emissions connected to flying. It's an activity in which a lot of us participate together. Now, the one thing to say right off the bat is that when there's significant reduction in flights, or significant reduction in individuals flying, that does cause airlines to fly less. So, there have been campaigns to reduce air travel in European countries, Sweden, Germany, other places. People are flying less for reasons of the climate, and there are fewer flights. So in the aggregate, it does make an impact. In terms of, I mean, if you want to, you can think about it as what do I as an individual, how do I as an individual make a difference? And you can also think about it at the collective level. At the individual level, it's true, it's unlikely that your decision not to fly will make a difference, but there's a chance that it could. There could be a case in which you are the tipping point in the decision of an airline whether to schedule a flight or not. So that's one point. And then the other point is, this is something that we all do together. And sometimes individuals participate in acts of collective harming. And one way to think about that is that we should avoid participating as individuals. We should avoid individual participation in collectively harmful practices. So that's how these are some of the ways I've tried to think about about this issue, but it's a good question.
And I'd like to add a couple of other thoughts. One is that by avoiding the flights, and in particular by avoiding the flights through exploring opportunities for getting to the same place, metaphorically, and investing with your academic and professional community in reducing flights, I think you have the opportunity potentially to change behaviors of multiple people, and across professional organizations, across your department, and other ways. And so there are ways you can have those professional development opportunities, but not necessarily travel for all of them. And when we've brought this up in faculty senate discussions, Anamari said that she herself has tried to reduce her travel and limit her professional development and engagement activities to once a year, and used her role and prominence to spark conversations about this in professional societies, and that ends up resulting in a culture change in the way that the organization that she's a part of pursues their professional development, but also, of course, of the university. Leadership is very important to create space for these things. And so I think we need to be mindful that our behavior doesn't just have implications at the individual level. Our behavior has implications for what our students and trainees see, and for our peers. And there are a lot of ripple effects that in aggregate can be quite substantial.
Great, thanks, Jeremy, and thanks, Jamie, for those responses. The next question that we have from Jacob, Marilyn, I think is probably best directed to you. So how do we actually track airline travel for UW employees in the community?
Yeah, I'll try to make this short and not too boring. Basically, we have two financial systems for tracking air travel. One is used to be called e-travel, and it's simply travel that is reimbursed through the university financial systems, and the other is our central travel accounts. So most of the travel we track is through those two means, and we're aware that there's some travel that falls outside of that. Actually, we do also track study abroad, and we've started to make an effort. There are some flights that charter flights through UW Athletics, so we started to try to track those. But we're aware certainly any flights, for example, that faculty or students pay for themselves are not included. So we're just tracking the flights that go through our central travel, our reimbursement systems. And then basically we have information about, date of travel and origin and destination, and then we make assumptions that it's a direct flight. Actually, the reason we don't have up-to-date data is because of the finance transformation. We have a new system, just starting to get data out of that, and it looks like that will show us the legs of the flight, so we'll be able to get a little more accurate. And then in terms of calculating the emissions, we use the EPA has what they call emission factors for flights based on if they're short, medium, or long haul. Short haul, you have relatively higher emissions because so much of the emissions are from takeoff. And so you have, obviously a shorter flight with still the same takeoff. And then long haul, because it has to carry, the plane has to carry so much fuel and people are carrying more luggage. So that has a little bit higher per mile impact. And then there's also what's called the radiative forcing factor. We follow the guidance of Stanford, and there's a multiplier because of the contrails produced, the little sort of clouds behind planes actually have global warming impact. So it's not just from combustion.
Excellent. Thanks, Marilyn. And for those who really want to dive into the details of methodology, the UW Sustainability Office just published our 2022 emissions inventory that includes the methodology for air travel. It's on our website, so I encourage you to go in there and get into the weeds if you would like. Sandor, I see that you have your hand up, and it looked like you might have a question around what Marilyn was just talking about. So go ahead and unmute yourself and give it a go.
Looks like you're still muted. Oh,
Oh, we may have lost.
There were also some questions in chat, and I noticed Sandor had a question in chat. I don't know if it's the same question.
Oh, okay, great. I see. Yes, it's in chat. So maybe I'll move to that one. If we, the UW community, do truly view climate change as a crisis, then the arguments for travel to maintain or improve the university's reputation, or to increase our own professional visibility, networking, etc., have little or no merit, in my opinion. If we are truly in crisis, then we ought to evaluate any travel based on its net carbon benefit to humanity, and not just to us scientists or the UW. And if that is negative, we should avoid that travel. Thanks, Sandor. Great comment. Okay. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get all these questions, but really we have about 5 minutes left. So we will capture all of these and be sure to have a landing spot for some of your questions. Somebody had a great question here in the Q&A that I wanted to address, which was related to if we required any type of internal carbon offset or fee at UW as part of that take responsibility two-pronged approach. Has there been discussion about whether this is allowable on a variety of funding sources that we work with? For example, we may not be able to use those fees if faculty have a federally funded research grant, for example. So any of our panelists could probably answer that one. Jeremy or Marilyn, would you like to take that one?
I'm happy. Or Jeremy, did you want to?
No, you go ahead, please.
Certainly, that's a conversation we're having. One model we're looking at is UC Berkeley recently launched a travel fee program, and they basically divided it up into what they call restricted travel with restricted funds and non-restricted funds. So different universities are looking at it differently. There is this issue that some grant sources will not allow you to pay for offsets or even for internal, either market offsets or internal offsets. So sometimes they'll just have the department pay the fee, or they'll only have the fee apply to those unrestricted funds. There's a short answer, but it's definitely a conversation that we'll continue to have.
And I'll note that even some grant funds are restricted and don't currently allow for that. That is a policy that could always change with appropriate pressure from those who are funded by those grants. And then also all grants come with indirect returns that are not restricted. And so when you go to your department and ask for coverage for those fees, they should be taken out of the indirect costs for those grants, which I understand go to administration. But if we collectively feel this is an important priority, then we should support action on it using the resources we have.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions before we wrap up. The next question I'm seeing in the Q&A is, can you provide empirical evidence that people choosing not to fly has actually reduced the number of flights worldwide? So I want to give Jamie or Jeremy a chance to answer that, and if not, I can try to address it.
I'll just say, I mean, very briefly, one example is the pandemic. People flew a lot less and there were a lot fewer flights.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Jamie. I think the other point here that we're trying to deliver with this discussion is just the incredible amount of potential that we have to reduce flights worldwide if you're working through your networks. So, you know, one example that Jeremy brought up is just if you're, and one that our president, Anna-Marie Kause, brought up, is that if you're actually working through your professional networks, working with colleagues to challenge the idea that you may not need to attend an in-person conference twice a year, or, you know, you could do an in-person conference every other year, for example. And that has enormous potential and enormous impact to reduce flights and trips by flights. One example that I don't know if anyone from UW joined the graduate guest lecture yesterday from economist Kate Rayworth, famous for donut economics. She actually joined virtually instead of flying here in person from halfway across the globe to make a point. She says, we've done this, you know, we've learned how to do this during the pandemic, and we need to really make an effort to learn how to do this more and better. So we're seeing a lot more people doing this and making it a point to meet virtually, because we've done it before. We've done it for the last couple of years, right? Pretty darn well. Okay. I will do one last question. Actually, you know what? I'm realizing it's 1 o'clock. So I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I think we'll leave it there and wrap up. I want to thank you so much to our 3 panelists, Jeremy, Jamie, and Marilyn, for an excellent webinar and starting this discussion with our community. And we look forward to seeing you in May for the second part of this webinar, where we're going to start talking about proposed solutions. So thank you so much, everyone, for your engagement and your great questions and your participation. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.